I hear of Western politicians or Western commentators becoming frustrated with Ukraine's request for weapons and wishing that Ukrainians would be more grateful for the Western aid to them, I think, well, how grateful can the Ukrainians really be when, okay, the West is sending these weapons, but it's the Ukrainians themselves who are having to carry these weapons and use them at horrific loss of life. The ones who are paying the real price, it's not in billions of dollars, it's not in units of weaponry, but it's in lives, and it's being paid by Ukraine. Hi everyone, thanks for watching. If you like what I'm doing, please be sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it. I'm going to start off by reading a bit from this article by Responsible Statecraft titled "The Danger of Downplaying the Ukrainian Battlefield Toll." Subtitled, "Are Americans supporting a policy of brutal attrition based on incomplete and skewed Western coverage of the war?" Ukraine will win. Some variation of this has become the unofficial mantra of U.S. policy towards Ukraine war, asserted in countless columns, interviews, and speeches, ones often pledging open-ended U.S. commitment to the Ukrainian war effort and chiding policymakers for not sending greater quantities and more escalatory types of weapons. It was partly on this basis, in fact, that with enough support, Ukraine could militarily defeat a Russia weaker than many thought, that then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson reportedly urged against peace talks early in the war. This was a rumor that first started circulating kind of in the pro-Russia media, pro-Russia commentators or neutral commentators, but then was pretty much confirmed by former Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, who said that in his opinion, he had a 50-50 chance of bringing both sides to a ceasefire after a few weeks of fighting, but that Western pressure caused Ukraine to back out of that supposed deal. So like so many things in this war, what starts off as kind of vague rumors, stuff appearing in Russian media or in media of countries who are kind of outside of Western sphere of influence, ends up becoming confirmed, or at least gaining a lot more credibility as time goes on. This attitude has been bolstered by the unconfirmed information that's trickled out publicly about the significant damage inflicted on the Russian military, besides a disastrous loss of equipment, including half of its usable tanks and as much as 8% of its active tactical combat aircraft by one estimate. The consensus among Western officials about Russian casualties seems to have settled on a staggering 200,000, with more killed than in all of its other post-World War II conflicts combined. Yet this central claim of an almost certain Ukrainian military victory over chastened Russian forces is asserted in the absence of one key measure of the military situation: verifiable battlefield losses. From the beginning of the war until now, Ukraine has, like Russia, treated its casualties as a state secret, one so closely guarded that not even U.S. intelligence and officials who advise the country's leadership on military strategy and assist in war planning know exactly how many Ukrainians have been killed and wounded over the past year. This is even though, as one Ukrainian officer told the Wall Street Journal in a recent piece about the grinding battle for the city of Bakhmut, the war is not won by the party that gains territory, but by the party that destroys the armed forces of the adversary. So this article goes on to discuss what the actual toll of personnel, the death toll, might be for the Ukrainian versus the Russian sides, and the demographic situation in Ukraine, which is quite dire. It talks about how Ukraine started with a population, a pre-war population of a little above 40 million, but that number is likely by now, after annexation and separation of a number of its territories and a lot of people fleeing the country, that number is now likely down into the 20s, into like the high 20s of millions. Now that's something that I think anyone could come up with just doing some simple math. I came up with a number of 25 to 27 million if you take the pre-war population, subtract out the populations of the territories that broke away from Kiev and that were subsequently annexed by Russia, subtract out also the known number of refugees both to Russia, to Poland, to Germany, to Czech Republic and other countries, and you're left with a population of somewhere in the mid to high 20s of millions. And I've heard some people say that that number is actually much less. So again, just to stress the very difficult situation that Ukraine finds itself in, its casualties are certainly a lot higher than they have officially admitted to. Back in summer of 2022, late summer maybe, it started coming out again in like Russia-leaning or neutral type news outlets that Ukraine had suffered over 100,000 military deaths, and this was supported by a leaked document from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Eventually, that number started being repeated by Western officials and in Western media. It's kind of an example of how a lot of these stories have gone. What starts off as Russian propaganda that needs to be treated with a lot of suspicion ends up later on being talked about in unofficial interviews with Ukrainian soldiers or Western fighters coming out of Ukraine, telling their stories that support the supposed Russian propaganda, and eventually those kinds of stories become mainstream and get acknowledged by the Western mainstream media. All that to say that the military situation for Ukraine is dire. I think a reasonable look at the figures and the data that we know would have Ukrainian casualties being considerably higher than Russian casualties. There is a website, I'm putting the link in the description, by Russian opposition activists who track the real Russian casualties, trying to counter the propaganda of the Russian government. And their numbers come up not that much higher than what the Russian Defense Ministry puts out. So the Russian opposition anti-war political activists, their numbers are showing that Russian casualties are quite a bit lower than what we know about Ukrainian casualties. Now, of course, in war, it's not simply a case of whoever inflicts the most casualties wins. You know, look at the Vietnam War, where the Vietnamese communists lost somewhere between 2 and 4 times the number of troops as South Vietnam and their American and other allies. Yet it was the Vietnamese communists who ended up winning the war through determination. But it also took negotiations to bring that war to an end. It took negotiations for the American and other forces to stand down and leave the country, which then enabled the communist victory ultimately. So I think in any war, eventually negotiations need to come into the picture, and these Western backers of Ukraine need to actually have the interests of Ukraine in mind. It's one thing to send weapons, it's another thing to have to carry those weapons to the front line and attempt to use them against a very efficient and deadly enemy. When I hear of Western politicians or Western commentators becoming frustrated with Ukraine's request for weapons and wishing that Ukrainians would be more grateful for the Western aid to them, you know, I think, well, how grateful can the Ukrainians really be when, okay, the West is sending these weapons, but it's the Ukrainians themselves who are having to carry these weapons and use them at horrific loss of life. You know, the ones who are paying the real price, it's not in billions of dollars, it's not in units of weaponry, but it's in lives, and it's being paid by Ukraine. So ultimately, Ukraine's battlefield successes and the price they have paid for them will have to be converted into a settlement, to have to cash in whatever kind of capital they hold. They'll have to turn that into a negotiated result that can lock in some kind of agreement, some kind of an end to this war that Ukraine finds acceptable. Now, of course, at this point, that's probably not going to be what they could have had early in the war, or certainly not before the war started. You know, it's a different context now. There are different facts on the ground, and any settlement will certainly be less favorable than it could have been. But Russia has not been able to roll over Ukraine. Ukraine has fought very hard. They have certainly shown, I think, to Russia that this war will not end with any kind of a runaway Russian victory. You know, perhaps one of the more honest leaders on the Russian side, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the commander of the Wagner private military corporation, which is kind of like a paramilitary fighting for Russia, he estimates that it's going to be another 2 years of fighting before Russian forces reach the Dnipro River. Now, of course, that may be wrong, but what it does show is that a Russian commander who knows as much about this war as anyone does, who has literally been on the front lines. He frequently delivers video messages standing on the front lines with the sound of the artillery in the background. In his estimation, Russia cannot easily defeat Ukraine. So I believe, and I certainly hope, that this war will come to a ceasefire agreement sometime within the next year or so, and really it can't come soon enough for Ukraine. For everything that Russia has lost, including their soul, really the soul of the country, is this horrible war, and the tens of thousands of ruined lives on the Russian side, a whole generation of PTSD and war crimes and all the rest that they're going to have to face. Ukraine has suffered so much more, and I think that a realistic look at the cost of war would show that the only hope for Ukraine is to convert their battlefield successes into a settlement, and as soon as possible. I'm going to read here from this little parable in the Gospel of Luke chapter 14. Very interesting parable that Jesus gives about a political situation like this involving war and armies and numbers. Jesus says in Luke chapter 14, "Or what king, going to make war against another king, sitteth not down first, and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is yet a great way off, he sendeth an embassage, and desireth conditions of peace." Well, there's certainly some real wisdom in that. Unfortunately, these wars can take on a life of their own that can be much harder to stop than would seem practical. When it would seem like continuing a war doesn't benefit anyone, yet it continues because it's very hard politically, and for the personal ambitions and even personal safety of the politicians, it can be very difficult to bring a war to an end, to go against the forces that are pro-war in their country. So, but Lord willing, it can happen, and if some country can, like Israel did try to do during the opening weeks of the war, some country can get the two sides together at this point after each side has lost so much, I think there would be a real chance that each side would be willing to accept something less than their initial goals, and that this could come to an end, because it is clearly gone way too far, and these leaders need to look at the cost and make that decision that no, they have to find a different way to avoid furthering this war. Well, thanks for watching. Please be sure to leave some comments below, and I'll talk to you again soon.